Many of the modern Seventh-day Adventists have probably never heard of a man by the name of O.R.L. Crozier. That's C-R-O-S-I-E-R. Before talking about him, let me fill you in on something, though. You remember the 1844 failed predictions of the return of Jesus Christ by both William Miller and Ellen White. And yes, Ellen White predicted that same thing in Testimonies Volume 1. And to show you how misinterpreting one verse of Scripture can lead to fabrications, cover-ups, and outright lies. If they had gotten Daniel 8:14 right, none of this would have ever happened. But they didn't. So between 1844 and 1851, there came what is called the shut door policy of the Seventh-day Adventist, something that they try to wiggle out of and deny today, but yet facts show that it did happen. And here's how that came about, and O.R.L. Crozier came about. See, for 2 years, Ellen White didn't observe the Sabbath, and she didn't even think it was that important. But then all of a sudden, James Bates and James White show her the importance of the Sabbath. So lo and behold, she has a vision. Yes, the Sabbath is the greatest command of all. And now that she's put her mark of approval on it as a prophetess, the Seventh-day Adventists can't change their mind about it either. In fact, they would go on to say that if you did not observe the Sabbath, then you would not receive the soul of God. In other words, if you didn't observe the Sabbath, you could not be saved. Now, this was part of the shut door policy of 1844 to 1851. And this is how it came about. You see, the year of 1844 to 1851 now becomes a time of testing. James Bates goes back and misinterprets Leviticus chapter 16 and part of 17, and he sees where the high priest sprinkled blood on the mercy seat 7 times. So remember, they've already turned days to years. Now they're turning each sprinkling of blood to a year. James Bates says that every time that the high priest sprinkled blood on the mercy seat represented 7 years. So they are now in a time of tarrying, which would last between 1844 and 1851. And the time of tarrying for this is called the time of testing. And you can read this in a lot of the early writings of Seventh-day Adventists, especially Present Truth of 1847, 1848, and 1849. And you can find those in web archives on the Seventh-day Adventist. So what happens now is 1841 to 1851 becomes the time of testing. The door to salvation is shut. And in 1851, when Jesus comes back, the testing of this time is going to be whether or not you kept the Sabbath. And if he comes back and finds out you have not kept the Sabbath, then you will not make it into heaven. So the Sabbath day becomes the test of salvation and not the death of Christ. But other things needed to be covered up in here. And this is where O.R.L. Crozier comes in. So he is the one that invented this sanctuary doctrine that says there's 2 compartments in heaven. In the outer compartment, the holy place, Jesus was out here forgiving sins. But he's getting ready now to move into the most holy place, where the prohibition will be shut. He's already forgiven sins, and now he's moving into the most holy place. This happens in 1844. So now you have the 7-year tarrying period, coupled with the fact that O.R.L. Crozier says this is the sanctuary doctrine taking place, where Jesus in 1844 was standing outside in the holy place forgiving sins and making atonement for sins, is now getting ready to go into the most holy place. And once that happens in 1851, then he's coming back. Well, they needed a vision for this, though. He just couldn't say it. They needed their prophet to have a vision. Well, lo and behold, Ellen White has the vision. And she says on several occasions, and one time in the Day Star of October 7th, 1846, and also to a letter to a man by the name of Eli Curtis in 1847, where she says this: "The Lord showed me in a vision more than a year ago that Brother Crozier had the true light on the cleansing of the sanctuary." The word Crozier had already came up with this shut door policy that when Jesus entered into the most holy place, that the door of salvation was shut. Nobody else could enter into heaven. And then now he was coming back in 1851 to gather those who had kept the Sabbath as a testing period. So Ellen White has a vision about it, saying that Brother Crozier had the true light on the cleansing of the sanctuary. Well, about 6 months later, Crozier admits that he made a mistake. He admits that his interpretation was wrong, and he renounces his former teachings and says he was absolutely wrong in his teachings and he misinterpreted the Bible. Too late, though. Their prophet has already had a vision that he was right. So even though the man who misinterpreted to start with now can't even come back and correct himself because Ellen White has had the vision. And there was in a letter that he wrote as late as 1847, Crozier says this in a letter that he wrote pertaining to this. On account of our ignorance of the Scripture, my argument was more fully and more widely accepted than it deserved to be. In other words, he's saying I was wrong and my argument should never have been accepted. But it was too late. The prophet had had her vision, and now the man who came up with this and says that he interpreted it wrong can't go back to them and say I was wrong, and they change it because the prophet had already had her vision. And if they changed the vision of their false prophetess, then it would show everything they taught from there on out was wrong. Now they've tried to cover up this through the years. In fact, Ellen White, as early as 1850, is still predicting the return of Christ because of this sanctuary doctrine. And in 1851, Jesus does not return. And all of a sudden, this shut-door policy that they fabricated between 1844 and 1851 is dropped from the writings of the Seventh-day Adventists, and they begin to cover up for it. Make excuses. No, that's really not what she meant. In other words, they're changing the words of a prophet is what they're doing. They're trying to interpret what she meant by it, so they're changing the word of a prophet. So after 1851 comes all the fabrications and cover-ups and outright lies to cover up for their false prophetess. And this is something that modern Seventh-day Adventists hardly ever hear. Now I have some of these books, but you don't need the books to read this. It's online in a lot of the archives of the Seventh-day Adventists. You can read it for yourself. Ellen White believed this. She put her stamp of approval for a vision on a misinterpretation of the Bible. Once she put her vision on it, there's no going back then. And from there on, you begin to read their writings and see the fabrications and the cover-ups made by the Seventh-day Adventist. O.R.L. Crozier denied and renounced that he had made the wrong interpretation. Too late. The false prophetess had already had a vision on it. Until next time, this has been Golly saying, God bless.